His ex crashed our wedding, so I walked out. Now his parents are buying me a house, but he wants it because he's living in his car. Hey, so I was supposed to get married last month, but that didn't happen. And honestly, it's all because my ex-fiancé, Scott, made some really dumb choices. Now he's driving me up the wall, and to make things even weirder, his parents are trying to make it up to me by offering to buy me a house. Yep, a house. And Scott, for whatever reason, thinks I shouldn't accept it. I'm just stuck, not sure what the right move is anymore. For a little background, both Scott and I are 25. We met in college and started dating not long after we graduated. Before that, though, we had this on and off flirty friendship thing going on since our second semester. He never made a move back then, even though the sparks were obviously there, but after we finished school, he finally worked up the nerve to ask me out. I said yes, of course. We dated for a couple of years, everything felt solid, and last year he proposed. I was over the moon and said yes without hesitation. Honestly, things between us felt perfect. I really believed nothing could possibly go wrong. But wow, was I mistaken. Before me, Scott had only been in one serious relationship, and that was with his childhood sweetheart. Let's just call her Caroline. I'd never met her in person, but I had seen a few photos in his high school yearbooks. They were even voted best couple their senior year. I guess it made sense. Scott told me they'd been together since middle school. He never brought her up himself, but I did hear bits and pieces from his old friends. Apparently, they were inseparable growing up, best friends all through elementary school, and then they started dating in middle school. By high school, they were actually talking about getting married someday. But things didn't go as planned. Caroline's dad wanted her to go to business school out in New York, which was pretty far from where we all lived. They gave long distance a shot once college started, but it didn't work out. They ended up breaking up just a few months in, after a lot of arguing. The thing is, I didn't know any of this when Scott and I first got together. He didn't introduce me to his old school friends until we'd already been dating for 3 months. I always found it a little strange that he'd never mention Caroline, especially considering how long they'd been together and the fact that they'd even talked about marriage. That seemed like kind of a big deal to leave out. And what made it feel even weirder was that Scott and I were already friends during his first year of college, right around the time he and Caroline were breaking up. We had that light, flirty vibe going, and I had no clue he was still nursing a broken heart back then. Even after we became a couple, Scott never said a word about her. He had scrubbed his social media clean of any trace of her, so there wasn't much for me to find even when I did a little snooping before we officially started dating. His friends didn't bring her up either, or at least they hadn't until one of them slipped. The day I found out about Caroline? That also happened to be the day of our very first major fight, which makes it pretty unforgettable. It was Scott's birthday, and he had invited all his old school friends over for dinner. He wanted to introduce them to me properly. I'd already met his family, and since we went to college together, I was familiar with his college crew. But these were the people from his past, the only ones who hadn't met me yet. So we decided to throw a little celebration at our place. Ironically, it was me who ended up learning more about Scott that night than any of his friends learned about me. After dinner, Scott stepped out to take a call from a relative, and while he was gone, his friends were joking around and being rowdy, just typical guy stuff. Somewhere in the middle of all that noise, one of them casually said he was genuinely surprised and glad that Scott had moved on from Caroline and seemed so happy with me. That stopped me cold. I made a face, like, wait, who's Caroline? And they could tell immediately they'd messed up. They tried to backpedal and brush it off, but the damage was done. I pushed them for answers, and they finally explained who Caroline was and how deep their history ran. I could tell they were scrambling to make it sound like it wasn't a big deal. But come on, being together since middle school and planning a future together? That's a big deal. After they left and things quieted down, I waited until Scott came back into the room. Everyone had mostly sobered up by then, so the timing felt right to bring it up. I asked him point blank why this was the first time I was hearing about Caroline. To me, it felt like he'd been trying to erase a huge part of his past, something he clearly didn't want me knowing. He got real uncomfortable real fast. Kept saying it wasn't anything important and tried to minimize the whole thing. He told me Caroline meant nothing to him and that it was just some silly high school romance he'd moved on from years ago. But I didn't believe him. I was hurt. Not because he had a past, but because he had hidden it from me like it didn't matter, or like I couldn't handle it. I told him I needed to know the full story. It was important to me. But Scott didn't see it that way. He kept insisting she had nothing to do with us and that bringing her up was pointless. When I pushed the issue, he snapped. Told me to mind my own business. That really stung. That was our first real fight. I ended up spending the night at a friend's place because I just couldn't deal with how he'd treated me. He made me feel like I was the one in the wrong for even asking. Said it wasn't his job to soothe my insecurities, especially over something as irrelevant as a high school relationship. But the real issue wasn't the relationship itself, it was the fact that he had kept it a secret for no good reason. Instead of acknowledging that, he turned everything around on me. Told me I was being paranoid and insecure. That my reaction just proved why he hadn't told me in the first place. Because I'd freak out. And I hate to admit it, but somehow, he managed to convince me I was the problem. But even after all that, I just couldn't shake the feeling. No matter how many times Scott said she didn't mean anything to him anymore, I kept feeling this low-grade jealousy that wouldn't go away. It stuck with me. I started questioning myself, wondering if I was being unreasonable or just overly emotional. And Scott? He played it smart. A few days after our fight, I began to doubt myself and think maybe I had blown the whole thing out of proportion. Eventually, I apologized. He accepted, but only on the condition that I wouldn't bring up Caroline again ever. He told me the reason he didn't like talking about her was because, according to him, she had been clingy, overbearing, and just flat out exhausting. He said it embarrassed him to even think about that time in his life because it reminded him of all the years he felt like he'd wasted on her. And now that he had me, he didn't want to waste a second more. So, I promised I'd let it go. And just like that, we moved on. After that, I met his school friends a bunch of times, and Caroline's name never came up except once. I figured Scott had probably given them all strict instructions not to mention her around me. The one and only time I heard about her again was a couple of weeks after our argument. I ran into the same friend who had accidentally brought her up in the first place, bumped into him at the grocery store, of all places. He looked kind of awkward when he saw me and ended up apologizing. Said Scott had told them about our fight and that he felt bad for causing it. He admitted it wasn't really his place to bring up Scott's past relationships, and he didn't mean to cause trouble. Then he told me something that actually made me feel a little better. He said that no matter how long Scott and Caroline had been together, he'd never seen Scott as happy with her as he was with me. Maybe he was just trying to clean up the mess, but I believed him. It gave me some peace of mind. It made me feel like everything Scott had said about being over her was probably true. And that maybe the secrecy really was about embarrassment or regret, not lingering feelings. And after that, Caroline just disappeared from our lives. His family was smart enough not to mention her around me, and his friends had definitely learned their lesson. A few months went by, and honestly, I stopped thinking about the whole situation. Life moved on, and so did we. Things between Scott and me felt really solid. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but nothing serious. I never once doubted our future together. But maybe I should have. Because in the end, that wedding never happened. And the reason? Ironically, it came right back to Caroline. Everything had been going great even the morning of the wedding. Scott was smiling from ear to ear. I had never seen him that happy. There were absolutely no signs, nothing to suggest what was coming. I had already walked down the aisle, standing there at the altar, ready to say our vows. And then, just like something out of a nightmare, Caroline showed up. She burst through the entrance, right in the middle of the ceremony, and shouted that we needed to stop. She said she couldn't let this wedding happen, not when she still believed that Scott was her soulmate. I recognized her immediately from those yearbook pictures. I'd always hoped I'd never have to meet her in person. I couldn't imagine any good reason why our paths would ever cross, and certainly not like this. I froze. Scott froze. Everyone froze. No one knew what to do. We didn't have any security. This was supposed to be a quiet, private ceremony, just family and a few close friends. We held it at Scott's uncle's property, which was tucked away and not open to the public. Hardly anyone even knew where it was, so we didn't think hiring security was necessary. Yeah. I regretted that decision later. While I stood there in total shock, I kept waiting for Scott to shut it all down, to tell her to get lost and kick her out. I expected him to be furious, to protect us. After all, he'd made it very clear in the past that he didn't want anything to do with her. But that's not what happened. Instead, Scott started talking to her, actually asking how she'd found out about the wedding. We hadn't exactly gone around posting the details online, so it was a fair question, I guess, but, come on. We were in the middle of our vows. He just forgot I was even standing there. Everyone was confused. He didn't tell her to leave. He didn't even glance at me. He just let her go on. And she did. Right there, in front of everyone, she started pouring her heart out. She said she'd heard about the wedding through a couple of his old friends. She was still in touch with people who casually mentioned it a few weeks ago. She told Scott she'd never stopped loving him. Said their breakup had been painful and bitter, and that's why she hadn't come back sooner. She said she'd waited, hoping he'd come around. At first, she tried to convince herself to let go, especially when she heard he was dating me. But once she found out we were getting married, she realized she couldn't stay silent anymore. She said she'd regret it for the rest of her life if she didn't try to stop it. She even explained that she hadn't meant to interrupt the ceremony itself. Said she got stuck in traffic and had originally planned to get there early to talk to him before it started. When that didn't work out, she decided she had no choice but to crash it. Then she dropped the bomb, told him she still loved him, had always loved him, and that the choice was his. If he truly wanted to be with me, she'd leave quietly, and we could all pretend this never happened. But if there was still anything left between them, then maybe they owed it to themselves to talk. She said all of this while standing right in front of me, and the worst part? Scott didn't say a single word to shut her down. He stood there, listening. And because he didn't ask her to leave, no one else knew whether they should intervene or just let it happen. So when Caroline finally said she'd walk away if Scott was sure about me, everyone turned to him, waiting. And I held my breath. I honestly thought that would be the moment he finally told her to leave. He had the perfect chance right there, and even up to that point, I was still willing to forgive him. I kept hoping he'd look her in the eye, say he was sure about me, and go ahead with the wedding. But that's not what happened. Instead of standing by me, Scott started arguing with her. Arguing. Right there at the altar, instead of shutting the whole thing down like a normal person, he launched into a speech about how unfair she had been, how she'd gone off to a different college and ended things, which apparently had never been part of their plan. And now, according to him, she was messing with his head because she couldn't figure out what she wanted. He said she was selfish. That she'd never once considered how he felt back then. Caroline apologized and told him she'd changed, but by that point, almost 10 minutes had gone by since she crashed the ceremony. I'd snapped out of my shock by then, and that's when it really hit me. They were having a whole emotional heart-to-heart about their past, right in the middle of what was supposed to be my wedding. I wasn't even a part of the conversation anymore. I was just standing there like some extra in a play that was no longer about me. And that hurt more than anything. I looked around, and everyone else seemed just as stunned. My parents. My bridesmaids. They were all frozen, unsure of what to do. And honestly, I can't blame them, who expect something like this. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I realized then and there that no matter what Scott claimed in the past, he clearly still had some sort of feelings for Caroline. And he had been lying to me, or at the very least, keeping the truth tucked away. I felt like a complete fool. So I walked away. Right there in my wedding dress, I turned and walked down the aisle, not as a bride, but as someone who finally saw the truth. And you know what Scott did? Nothing. He didn't chase after me. Didn't beg me to stay. The only thing he said was that he'd get back to me once he figured out whatever was happening. He actually told me to go wait in my hotel room while he sorted things out. Can you believe that? I barely made it back to my room before I completely broke down. I mean, it was unbelievable. Instead of kicking her out, instead of protecting what we had, he let it all spiral into chaos. And I was left alone on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, it felt like something out of a bad rom-com, except I wasn't the leading lady. I was the girl who gets dumped at the altar because her fiancé is still hung up on his ex. And I had been too blind, too in love, too trusting to see it coming. While I was sobbing alone in my room, maybe 15 minutes later, my parents and bridesmaids came to check on me. They told me they'd left the venue. Apparently, Scott and Caroline had stepped aside to have a private conversation before they came back to resume the ceremony. That was it for me. I started crying all over again, because deep down, I knew this wasn't just a pause. There wasn't going to be a wedding. Not that day. Not ever. My parents said they'd already asked the rest of our family to go home. They figured things weren't going to pick back up again, and honestly, I was grateful they took charge. They told me I should come home with them, that I didn't deserve to be humiliated like this. And I agreed. I didn't wait around for Scott to finish talking to Caroline or come looking for me. I just quietly packed my things, with help from my bridesmaids, who were so sweet about handling the guests so I wouldn't have to. Within an hour, I was in my parents' car, heading back to their place, crying the entire way. My mom sat beside me, trying to comfort me the best she could, but my heart was shattered. Still, some ridiculous part of me was holding on to hope that maybe Scott would call, say he made a mistake, and beg me to come back, that we'd still have our wedding, even if it was a little late. But he didn't call. Not until that evening. And even then, the message wasn't what I'd hoped for. He didn't want to get married or get back with Caroline either. He said he wasn't ready for either relationship right now and needed time alone to figure out how he felt about both of us. Just like that, it was over. He told me that he and Caroline had talked for hours after I left. They'd finally said everything they hadn't during their breakup. And in doing that, he realized he might not be completely over her. That was why he'd always avoided talking about her, because deep down, he still had unresolved feelings. He admitted that he couldn't keep running from that anymore, and he didn't think it was fair to keep me in limbo. So he was breaking things off with both of us. Until he had clarity. He added that his parents would be handling all the expenses from the wedding, so I wouldn't need to worry about any of it. Then he ended the message with an apology, said he was truly sorry for ruining what was supposed to be a beautiful day, and that he hoped I could forgive him someday. But for now, we needed space. Reading that text broke me in a whole new way. I started crying so hard I thought I was going to throw up. I felt sick, physically sick, for days. I couldn't even go back to my own place. I had to stay with my parents while they took care of me and tried to help me recover, bit by bit. Surprisingly, Scott's parents were really kind through all of it. A few days after the wedding, they reached out and apologized for everything he'd done. Said they were ashamed and that they'd do whatever they could to make it up to me. But I couldn't ask them for anything. None of this was their fault. They were good people. What Scott did, that was all on him. Once the vendors had been paid and everything was officially cancelled, I told myself I needed to take a step back and just process it all. I mean, it's not every day you spend months planning a wedding with someone you love, only to have it crash and burn because his ex shows up and he doesn't have the backbone to walk away from her. It's been almost a month now. And yeah, I can laugh about some of it when I'm with my therapist, or even joke that my life turned into a Hallmark movie gone horribly wrong. But deep down, I'm still working through it. Still figuring out how to move on. Even now, it still hurts. I don't know what Scott's been doing with his life because, right after I replied to his text, I deactivated all my social media and blocked him everywhere. I told him in that last message that I was making things easier for him. He didn't have to choose between me and Caroline anymore because I was removing myself from the picture. And with that, I cut off all contact. He didn't try to reach out again, at least not at first. Then, just a few weeks ago, his parents stopped by to visit me. Turns out, his dad had just been promoted to CEO, and with that came a huge salary increase. They'd come into a lot of money, and they told me they still wanted to buy me a house. Apparently, they had always planned to gift one to me and Scott as a wedding present. And now, even though the wedding never happened, they still wanted me to have it as a gesture to make up for the mess their son had caused. Since the wedding, I've been living at my parents' house. I didn't have anywhere else to go. The place Scott and I used to live in was a shared lease, and I didn't want to risk running into him. My bridesmaids had gone back about a week after the disaster to pack up my things, and they told me the place was completely empty. Scott had already moved out. When I talked to the landlord, he confirmed that Scott had pulled out of the lease and that I was the only tenant left. I explained the situation and told him I wouldn't be coming back. Honestly, even if I wanted to, it wouldn't have made sense. I couldn't afford the rent alone, and emotionally, I just couldn't go back to what used to be our home. So when Scott's parents made that offer, I didn't see any reason to turn it down. I needed a place to live. I couldn't stay with my folks forever, and if his parents were kind enough to help, why should I say no? Well, somehow, Scott found out. And then he started blowing up my phone from random numbers, trying to guilt me into turning the offer down. Apparently, he's homeless now and has been living in his car for a few weeks. He thinks he deserves the house, and that I should tell his parents no so they'll give it to him instead. He never explained how he ended up in that situation, just kept saying it wasn't any of my business, but that I should feel bad for taking something he needed more. He kept repeating that it would be selfish of me to accept. But I was tired of being blamed for everything. So finally, I told him I wasn't going to even consider his side unless he told me the whole truth. And, surprisingly, he did. He admitted that after the wedding fell apart, he quit his job. Just like that, no 2 weeks notice, no plan. He said he needed to soul search and decided to spend a week off the grid on some islands in Japan. He blew through most of his money during that time and didn't bother checking in with anyone, not even his parents. When he got back, he expected them to just take him in like nothing had happened. But they were furious. He'd disappeared without warning and hadn't even bothered to give them an explanation. So they had a huge fight, and he told them he didn't need their help anyway. Of course, he realized pretty quickly that he did need them because he'd already ended the lease on our old place and had nowhere else to go. But by then, it was too late. He had burned bridges with his parents and with his friends. Apparently, he got into it with them too after the wedding for telling Caroline the details in the first place, so none of them wanted anything to do with him now. He found out about the house his parents were planning to give me through his dad's realtor. The guy had no clue the wedding had been cancelled and called Scott to ask what kind of house he was interested in. He assumed the gift was still for the two of us. That's how Scott figured it out. His dad had told the realtor to find a place near my job. Honestly? That kind of sleuthing must have taken some serious effort. But once Scott finished his long, drawn-out explanation, I didn't say a word. I just hung up and blocked that number too. I know it was cold. But after everything he'd put me through, I didn't care. He broke my heart in the worst way, so he doesn't get to act like I'm the villain now. As far as I'm concerned, I've earned a little pettiness. Update 1. After that, I finally reached out to Scott's parents and told them I was ready to accept their offer. I told them I appreciated everything and, frankly, felt like I deserved a fresh start. I also mentioned that Scott was homeless, just in case they didn't know. But they said they were aware and had been willing to help if he apologized and owned up to his mistakes. So far, he hadn't, and they weren't going to chase after him. I agreed with them. He needed to learn how to clean up his own messes. He's been trying to contact me ever since I ended that last call, but I'm done. That door is closed now. I hope he figures it out, but not with me involved. Update 2. It's been a couple of weeks now, and I've officially moved into my new house. Scott's parents and mine were both incredibly supportive. I even threw a little housewarming party recently and invited the same guests who were at the wedding. I wanted to thank them for how gracious and kind they'd all been during the aftermath. Everyone was so sweet, and many of them said I looked much happier now than the last time they saw me. And honestly, I am doing better. Way better. As for Scott, I don't know exactly what he's up to. A couple of my friends did some harmless social media stalking and said it looks like he might be living with Caroline now. Based on the photos, he's definitely in a woman's house. The decor kind of gives it away. But you know what? I don't care anymore. He can live wherever, with whoever. Just as long as it's far, far away from me.